the debate about players playing too many games has raged again after Rodri mentioned that players could possibly go on strike if this continues. What we're gonna do is go through both sides of the argument and try and make some sense of it. Welcome to Campfire Football. I'm Sebastian North. I've been watching football closely since the late 90s, early 2000s, and I just don't understand where this whole there are way too many games being added all the time thing comes from. So I decided to do some research and figure out if what we're being told by the media is real or just gaslighting. A bunch of players have come out in recent years talking about the fact that there are just too many games being added all the time and it's just not fair. Now this makes people react in a couple different ways. Some are like, absolutely, this is totally wrong. And others are like,
you could trouble me for a warm glass of shut the hell up.
Now, I think both people kind of have a point, so we have to go through some of the real statistics here. First, let's start with the player's perspective that too many games are on the calendar. For them, playing more than, say, 60 to 70 games a year is just unsustainable. Obviously, the concern is that they will get injured, and this is fair. Soft tissue injuries have gone up 20 to 30%, and they are very difficult to come back from once you have one. So that's totally fair, and a lot of people will say that, well, it's the pace of the game and the amount of running that has led to this. And there are some facts to back that up as well. Players are on average running more and also at higher intensity. There are a lot more sprints than, for instance, back in the 90s.
I don't want to chase anybody. I don't like to run.
The other issue is the amount of recovery time and breaks there are. So teams coming back from, say, international duty, having to play just a couple days later. Or the amount of time that they get off in the summer and then going out on tour for preseason, like Chelsea coming to the United States and going from coast to coast just to play a few friendlies on actually some pretty poor pitches. And then, of course, there is the whole mental stress for players. Ever since social media became kind of a staple for them, they've had to see a lot more of the criticism that they otherwise wouldn't 20 years ago. But then you have the internet, YouTube, fan TVs, and of course Instagram, TikTok, and all the other things that allow fans to just say what they want. And if players are going to be on their phones and take a look, I'm sure that's not easy to handle. The other thing is that they need more security. They are not as safe as players were back in the 80s and 90s. They can't just like walk their kids to school as easily. So now they have to protect themselves a lot more. Now, obviously, a lot of these problems come from the fact that they earn as much as they do. As Biggie said,
the more money you make, the more problems you get.
And that is really where the rubber meets the road on this. For a lot of people, these complaints from players are just not legitimate. I mean, when you make like $200,000 a week playing the sport you love, and then you're complaining about it, I mean, that really doesn't float well with a lot of regular people. But the reality is they are big level entertainers and kind of the same for others in their position in other industries. For instance, Ed Sheeran and Taylor Swift, they both played about 54 shows last year in about 10 months. That's like the exact same as Rodri, who played 59 games in 11 months. All right, so let's go back to 1964-65, before substitutions were allowed. George Best, he played 59 times for Manchester United and 10 times for Northern Ireland. So 69 in total that season, and he was playing all 90 minutes of every single game. Oh, and don't forget that George Best partied like hell and was an absolute alcoholic. Moving forward, Kenny Dalglish played more than 50 games a season for Liverpool for 14 consecutive years. Moving into the 90s, Ryan Giggs played 58 games for Man United in the 93-94 season and 59 in 2002-2003. Zinedine Zidane played 64 matches for club and country in 1997-98. Frank Lampard in the 06-07 season, he played 62 times for Chelsea. In 2017-2018, Kevin De Bruyne played 62 times for club and country. And last year, Rodri played 59 times for Man City and 10 times for Spain. So going off of all that, doesn't sound like there's any kind of increase. And keep in mind, back when George Best and Kenny Dalglish were playing, they were not getting substituted. Now there are 5 substitutions. So where are all these extra games coming from that we're hearing about? Well, people are quick to point out things like this new Champions League format that came in. They've added 64 games to this competition. Yeah, but here's the thing. It's only 2 more per team. So it's all about how you frame these statistics.
Talk about nonsense. We're gullible, but we're not that gullible.
Also, no one mentions the fact that the Champions League format from 98 to 2003 involved 2 group stages of 6 games. People also talk about the Nations League being added, but that replaced friendlies. Then they'll talk about the Euros expanding from 16 to 24 teams. Okay, so that adds one knockout game. Same with the World Cup in 2026 going to 48 teams. That is still only going to add one game to the schedule for the team that goes the farthest. And then, of course, they bring up the FIFA Club World Cup that is going to happen next summer, and that hasn't even happened yet. By the way, here's another source of more games. It's international qualifiers. That is actually one of the biggest sources of games being added to the overall calendar. And there's a basic, simple reason for this. Think about this. After the Soviet Union falls and also the old Yugoslavia, you've got like a couple dozen countries added to FIFA and UEFA. CONCACAF has added 13 nations to the roster since 1990. On top of that, you've got things like the Europa Conference League, and people bemoan, oh, look at all these extra matches. But what that actually did was reduce the amount of games in the Europa League, and a lot of the players playing in the Conference League are not internationals and normally only played about 40 to 50 games a year. And there have been things that have mitigated all the games. Think about this, the FA Cup, they've scrapped replays past the third round. Numerous countries have gotten rid of their League Cup, and the English are just barely hanging on to what is now the Carabao Cup. That tournament was actually a money grab back in the 1950s, so get rid of it. But the irony there is that the big players barely even play in the League Cup. They only do if their team gets to the semis or the final. In the earlier rounds, they just play the kids. The key is, most of this does not affect the absolute biggest players. The Club World Cup next year will, of course, and I understand that players would prefer to have like a 4 to 6 week break over the summer, but that kind of falls on deaf ears to most of the public who don't, and you make as much money as you do.
Anybody care about what I want?
I do.
Shut up. Get out.
And I think that's the glaring problem, is that people see a lot of the improvements that have happened in the game. Like, the pitches are way better. Players are protected from insane tackles like they weren't before. VAR has a big role to play in that. The nutrition, the sports science, all of this has improved and made it so that players are actually fitter and able to play at the level that they are. So why is this brought up and talked about the way it is? Well, let's be clear about something. Rodri didn't just come out and say, you know what? We're going to strike. That idea was actually put forward to him by a journalist, and this is what always happens. Journalists will come out and say, you know, FIFA's just added this many games to the overall calendar, and one other player has mentioned that you guys are playing too much. I mean, how many players are going to be like,
I would like to say that I couldn't care less with what he says. I couldn't care less. Not interested at all.
no, of course you're not going to hear that. Most of the guys are going to be like, oh, well, I'm being given the opportunity to kind of be a little bit of a victim here, and they take it.
You can do something. You have agency other than moaning and complaining. Don't just go and bump this all on UEFA and FIFA, who, for all their limits and all their many, many flaws, redistribute this money around the world to football clubs and therefore footballers who are a lot less rich than you are. You don't just fall into the trap and think, oh, look, they're greed.
That word greed is what really gets journalists going. It's way more fun to attack what you consider to be the boogeyman. Infantino, Ceferin, club owners. Basically, these journalists have a very strange eat the rich mentality when it comes to reporting on this, and they never ask the very simple question, who is it that has the power to reduce the amount of games players are playing?
Their issue is with their clubs. So I'd like to see some of these players rock up into the various offices of the various CEOs and owners and suggest to them that they don't want to play. Right, I'm signing a new contract with you fellas. Here's a condition of my contract. I'm only going to play 50 games. That's his gift. He's a superstar elite player. Don't you forget that now. Of course, they're the ones that make the game. If it wasn't for them, there'd be no game.
Will they get paid a little less for that? Yep. And I hate to just be cynical and say, well, then players would never agree to that. But that's also kind of the world we live in. Everyone's like, you demand what you are worth, you demand what you should be paid, and you don't take no for an answer. So players are not taking no for an answer. They're driving hard bargain negotiations. But then they go out and they say, yeah, it's too many games and it's FIFA's fault.
Don't just go and bump this all on UEFA and FIFA.
The other thing for players, look, if social media is so taxing for you, get off it. You make so much money, you do not need it. And if it's all about growing your brand, take a look at Mathieu Flamini. He doesn't have a brand. He works for some biotech company, has become a billionaire. That's how you leverage intelligence and wealth, my friend. So that's all I got for that. Thanks for stopping by. I'm Sebastian North. This is Campfire Football. Take it easy.